This is the weekly lesson for study until the 14th of July 2024. Subject: Government housing, friend or foe? The UK was a very industrial place until Margaret Thatcher came on the scene in the 1980s. For many people up until that time, the daily grind involved working shifts in the local factory. In my case, my whole family worked in the local steel factory. That included my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and even my great-great-grandfather, until he was fired for promoting trade unions in the early 1900s. Meanwhile, the women were working, where there were not enough men, in the local thread mills, which offered lighter work. In the early days, going back to the 1840s, my family lived in small cottages, which were only big enough to hold a handful of people. Like most people of their day, they raised between 10 to 15 children. By the time the 1920s came, slums had developed. There was no running water, no indoor sanitation, and rows of houses were built around the steelwork factory with simply 2 rooms and running water with outside toilets. In the 1930s, the government realized there were issues with sanitation and started to build housing estates known as housing schemes or council estates, which they could rent to employees of local factories. This marked the beginning of organized housing built around towns which were themselves formed to support local industry. Moving forward 100 years to 2024, the northern part of the UK is dominated by these estates, and the government remains one of the largest property owners. In Scotland, the government owns a quarter of all total rentable accommodation. I remember visiting my grandparents in the 1980s, and both my maternal and paternal grandparents were happily living on council estates. The towns where they lived had 3 council estates. They knew all of the neighbours, people who were economically the same and were either friends or relatives. These estates tended to be full of old, hardened women who clearly had battled their way into old age, whose families had left home years before. In many ways, they were the matriarchs of these estates, knowing exactly what buttons to press to ensure the government took action when they needed a repair to their homes or have someone forcibly removed. It felt strange because the people were poorer compared to today, yet they were incredibly proud. In the north of the UK today, renting an apartment or house from the government is considered perfectly normal and accessible for everyone because there's little choice. Whereas in the south, where there was less industry and more education, fewer of these estates exist. Since the government owns a lot of property, they are also one of the largest employers in Scotland and Northern England. Plumbers, electricians, maintenance people, office staff, and housing managers are all required. As you would expect from the government, the salary isn't great, though the working conditions are better than the private sector. So they generally attract unskilled workers who are happy with a lower pay. This is a very attractive option for boys who do not want to enter further education, many of whom grew up and live on council estates themselves. Things are slowly changing. The local government here has started to demolish some of these old homes in order to build new ones for residents. The combination of an aging population as well as houses no longer meeting basic standards of living, such as energy saving and noise pollution, means that they need to look at how they provide accommodation. Some of these estates historically had very bad reputations and needed to be demolished, as well owing to their high crime rates and social problems. Since the 1990s, the local government has been proactively demolishing and rebuilding, making these properties safer to live in. Selling the ground to property developers also means many council estates are surrounded by luxury privately owned property developments, which creates a kind of a hybrid, displacing the cold sting of poverty associated with these estates in the past. Unlike today, where we can define home as a mental construct, a structure of love and family, a place of peace we can choose to reside in the old days, home and house was all about physicality, bricks and stone. As the metaverse or holographic universe comes upon us, we will once again be asked to redefine dwellings as an ethereal space. The jury is out on what exactly the future will look like, but it will likely offer us personal and communal spaces to live together.